tabernacles, a tent. You know, that's the language Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 5 and early part of chapter 6, where he talks about our bodies being a tent, our bodies being a tabernacle, and that we will one day put these off and put on another tabernacle, another tent, our resurrection body. And so this feast has its fulfillment in the resurrection that is yet to come. Yet to come. Now if you look at that eschatology, that way of understanding the end, it lines up pretty much with how early Christians and the early church regarded the unfolding of time. Now, when we talk about Bible prophecy, when we talk about the end of the world, Bible prophecy, there's usually some really big concepts that people introduce into this. Words like the Antichrist, words like the beast, words like the tribulation, words like the rapture occur in people's thinking and language. And I want to suggest to you that while some of those concepts are contained in certain Bible prophecy books, prophetic books of the Bible, sometimes people take those concepts out of one book and superimpose them into the books, other books of the Bible that were never there in the first place. Let me give you an example. Antichrist. I've had people really take me to task over some claims I make about this, but I'll put this claim out again as well. The book of Revelation does not mention the Antichrist. The word, the Antichrist, appears nowhere in the book of Revelation. In fact, the Antichrist appears in the writings of John in his epistles only. That's the only place it appears. And yet people have written entire books about this as if the whole New Testament talks about it. And it doesn't. So there's just an interesting confusion of prophetic concepts. Another one is the tribulation. People assume certain things into other parts of the Bible. They make all these assumptions. Another one is the word rapture. The word rapture doesn't occur in the Bible. And people have almost built an entire doctrine of the rapture based on Jerome's Vulgate translation, which is a Latin translation of the New Testament. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he uses a Latin word that sounds like rapture, which means to be caught up. And it's a Latin word. It's got nothing to do with English, and that Latin word is then put into English, and people have invented an entire doctrine about it. But it's not there. People have confused concepts that speak of the resurrection. Like, for example, the Bible uses an expression, rise up. They will be raised up. It speaks of resurrection. It's always spoken of resurrection. And they've made it mean rapture, which was never there, never in the text, never even intended in the text, and so on. And I could go on and share some of these concepts with you. In a moment, I want to have a look at just some of the really bizarre types of speculation that go on about the end of the world. Firstly, I want you to understand that the New Testament refers to the end of the age. The end of the world is not necessarily what is being spoken of. Not necessarily. And I want you to see that in just a moment. And I guess the concept that many modern Christians have, that any moment now, rapture is going to happen, the world's going to be plunged into a 7-year tribulation, and Antichrist is going to rule the world, and then there'll be the Battle of Armageddon, and then there'll be this big bun fight, and then Christ will come and sit on David's throne in Jerusalem. You need to understand that concept is less than 180 years old. Unheard of prior to 1830. Let me give you some examples. This guy, Bishop Lightfoot, was a 17th century scholar. And he taught that the New Testament expression, last days, referred not to the end of the world, but to the last days of the Old Covenant. I'd like you to turn, as we just pause there. Please turn to Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13. Hebrews 8:13. And have a look at this amazing verse. Of course, the book of Hebrews was written either late 63 AD or very early 64 AD, just before Nero's persecution of the church began, which began in 64 AD and ended mysteriously. It ended with his mysterious death in 68 AD, which was a period of 42 months. And it says in Hebrews chapter 8, where the writer to these Hebrews is trying to encourage them, don't give up on Christ, keep going with Christ. God's on the throne, God's in control. No, you haven't misplaced your faith and trust in Christ. And it says in Hebrews chapter 8, last verse, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. So we all acknowledge that we're not under the old covenant now. The new covenant, the New Testament, the new covenant has made the old covenant obsolete. We don't sacrifice animals today for our salvation. But that's only the first half of the verse. Listen to the next half of the verse. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Now, I had someone take me to task on this, not in this city. They were dialoguing with me via email. They took me to task when I said, can you see that verse says that the old covenant was still in existence as late as 63 AD? And I said, that's one of the only reasonable explanations as to why Paul and other apostles were prepared to celebrate Old Testament ceremonies. And in Acts chapter 20, we find Paul going to the temple to participate in Old Testament ceremonies. This is the guy that wrote Galatians. How do you figure that? But if there's an overlap of covenants, if the old covenant didn't end at the cross but was made obsolete at the cross, it makes sense. And so here it says that the old covenant was about to be done away with. And Bishop Lightfoot was one of these scholars that just very matter-of-factly stated that when the New Testament refers to the last days, it's referring to the last days of the Old Covenant. The last days of the Old Covenant. In fact, something happened in 70 AD, which I'll come to in a moment, for which the next 200 or 300 years, Christian teachers and commentators and theologians and pastors wrote about as God fulfilling some of the biggest prophecies in the Bible. And thank God that he had brought the last days, the end of the ages, upon those people at that time. And if we have a look at Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 26, we find this amazing expression. For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly, it's obviously referring to Christ, since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once and for all at the end of the age to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And you'll find the same expression in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, where it refers to the cross and the period immediately following the cross as the end of the age. The end of that age. And it's also in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7, referring to the end of the Old Covenant. Well, Bishop Lightfoot, he goes on and he says that most of the book of Revelation was fulfilled by 70 AD. This is what he says. And he based this teaching on the writing of